All is good. Hello. Thank you, Lyn. It's wonderful to see you and everybody else. This is a reading of duet, dialogue, and pairings. And I'm going to start with a little duet that's in grand piano 10. And the duet is a cut up between a poem by Lorenzo titled Fine Clothes of Year Before Last, and a work by Kathy Acker that she gave at a poetry reading in 1979 at the Ear Inn with Lorenzo Thomas, which, according to my text here, says is a pilfering of Propertius, and that it involves Cynthia's fury, which you won't get that much of because this is a very brief little duet that I took from a recording of that event. Only fit now, there are such things as ghosts. Death does not all things end for the garden, the car wash, the ritual of stinking for 4 days and pale yellow from vanquished even shades escape their graves to solve a problem that stinks to you to high heaven and just in general stinks. You see, Jane was seen to lean over bed, sweating and sleeping, though near the roar of just buried Broadway in these shabby clothes. The rest of my performance is a reading of Drift à Deux in GP4, framed by another work of everyday life, which Drift à Deux focuses on, and the framing work is called Late to Work, which is a piece, a dialogue in Cloud Cantata that just came out from Paminar Press. Late to work. You know, I woke up late and fell into a reverie that lasted now. It's 4:58 p.m. I knew you were away, so I went about my business, some of which has been tearful. Do you want company? Tell me about where you were or how you were before you joined me now. I don't know if it is the same. I was brokenhearted too, though there was a spirit mending the broken, bound by a few living persons. I think I was lying down on the job for much of it on the settee with my legs flopped over the edge. More and more, I find myself gravitating to small furniture. The dog goes well on the settee. Yes, they are matchy-matchy, but I colonized it. She was scratching herself and sleeping on the floor. I don't know why I said that. You mean characterizing the dog as a decorative object? I imagined her, but not you. You've been seeing me lying down most nights for the past several decades. When one is in a reclining position awake, one may be addressing their thoughts to another person or making love or in their own head or practicing nonviolent civil disobedience or just disobedience, or maybe they are abjected by power, recovering from an accident or surgery or watching the stars expand their sense of insignificance in the universe. Who knows what goes on in the dog's mind? Sometimes I think any posture one imagines abstractly involves a prejudice or bias. Consider the metaphor lying down on the job. I think that's interesting because I was lying down on the job. I wasn't working, but missing things, people, my friend from the West Side staging a pyrotechnic universe of abject reality while contradicting such brutality. By now, he went about making this happen. by how he went about making this happen. Detroit finally put in streetlights, but the illumination coming from his mind has been filtered by the artifice of utility, by a curtaining or waiting for, by a temporally indefinite striating. The job is everywhere, and in that sense, every time you lie down on it, you lay on it. I hadn't thought of that. No, who has? You did, just now. But was the thought just an idle in reverse? Drift adieu. An overview would be a contradiction for writing everyday life. Works such as La Quotidienne, an atmospheric play, and The Middle reflect a preoccupation with the concept everyday life that includes a reading of the world as a text layered into the reading and writing of works or plays. And I don't just mean plays for the theater, although those too, but as in making plays in poker or athletics or love or friendship or philosophy or words or politics or social existence, and as a complement or challenge to works with their serious sense of labor and quasi-permanence against which plays may seem connected to some feminine impossibility, ludicity, impermanence, immensity, extending sentences ludicrously, lengthily. If we slide from the space of labor to a polyground of activity, then we let seriousness come in when she feels like it, without taking over the game. She will recount from time to time her arduous and not so arduous paths among the adieu of sentences in this entry. Writing is a creature twisting in the nettings she gets caught up in. Human beings are those creatures whose very landscape is alive. Among the various situationist methods is the dérive, literally drifting, a technique of transient passage through varied ambiances. The dérive entails playful constructive behavior and awareness of psychogeographical effects. Guy Debord. In these times of surveillance, insanity, and landscape death, the situationist urbanist project, whose purpose was the constant diminution of border regions within the city and suburbs up to the point of their complete suppression, seems as naive and comical as it is compelling and revelatory. Which terms in the previous sentence might one choose to embrace now? One can dérive alone, but a group is better. Yet Debord claims that 10 are too many because the dérive tends to fragment into several simultaneous dérives. And this troubling because parallel play is a sign of regression. Writing in the spirit of the dérive is not the same as constructing a dérive in physical space, yet might they not share in common fixating on new habitual axes to which they will constantly be drawn back. Later, the words in our tongues come out muddy. Pieces of our bodies stick to the city map. In 1972, I traveled on 2 feet through several yards, up over a fence or 3, under another or so, along the sides of stone buildings in narrow streets under the cover of night, with or without a flashlight or candles, down into a huge cellar or catacomb. The floors were dirt or stone or a mix of dirt and stone. The walls were dry and the architecture was sound. It was here that a 16-year-old man of our party helped himself to papers inside some old filing cabinets. In their transient passage from the catacombs in post-68 Paris, those old official papers surface in a zone of boarded up businesses, abandoned tailor shops, doorways, framing Moroccan and Tunisian immigrants in thin shirts, freezing shoebox apartment rooms, military police with submachine guns grouped around monuments, arriving at a site of luxurious indigence where a rabbit is eaten with the cabinet theft rebels who have roasted it slowly over a fireplace's open flame in the spacious sixth floor dining room of an abandoned building in the Marais. Our feast was interrupted by and then shared with feminists who had come to solicit our solidarity for a demonstration. But this writing isn't focused on Paris, where an other me behind a trash can ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, the packaged makings for which had been liberated from the drugstore late one night. That me also learned how to knit, but not purl, sat with a certain bee at a bar close to Jean-Paul Sartre himself, gaunt and made up, surrounded by acolytes, read Les Guerriers, standing in a Rive Gauche bookstore to keep warm on a freezing cold day, encountered a friend who reported she had been standing in a shower shivering for a day or two because she'd gone a little crazy, and attended a lecture at a Maoist prof's apartment when the university was closed down. The university was often closed down, and the apartment had no furniture. It was explained to me that, yes, the apartment was his, but he didn't live in it. Vivre and the derivations were thick with hidden content. In English, the verb to live sounds thin in comparison, or perhaps hidden content and its counterpart, thinness, are symptoms of not having yet achieved everyday life. There were not yet career, spouse, children, timetable, leisure, only provisionally dwellings, and in fact, there was a great deal of resistance to the acquisition of such things. Under a bed, I found some abandoned poetry. It was 30 or so pages of writing by Paul Eluard, translated into English and typed on onion skin paper. In order to recover this freak of birth, one must age. I had been thinking to call this entry Thicket, then changed the title to Drift, then added a bit more. Abruptly, it's impossible not to imagine Henri Lefebvre's everyday life in the modern world did not have something to do with the composition of La Quotidienne and The Middle, but my edition tells me I didn't own it until 1984. Drift, what dérive means in English, didn't fully describe my game. The plan is to make some sense and nonsense, hence the pairs don't follow plans. When I edit, I consider the autonomy of the work of art. The internalized genre leads the writer on to her discovery in another form in which the writing is highly compressed and marked by narrative tags, unquote, such as between now and then, where I mastered the things I had forgotten. I enjoy such conundrums, but I don't like forgetting people. What about the humans popping out of any animated thing one notices? The other day, my father called to inform me that his cousin Arthur had died in Keys, Oklahoma, where I once rocked on a porch curled in my 90-something great-grandmother's bony lap on a cricket screeching firefly night in '55 before my brother was born. But even after Dad described his cousins having been having been married 3 times, more or less, and his having been paid by the government not to farm the land left by his parents, Irv, who died young, and Lorena, whom I always knew as the oldest person I would ever know, I could not remember Arthur, even as I suspect that the last time I met him may have been on my parents' electric crabgrass lawn at a reception after my grandmother Harryman's funeral. Hands sweetened in tobacco stain from pipes and rolled cigarettes fill in these and other impression blanks. Thin and grizzled, Uncle Harold appears at the party where I saw him for the last time in baggy pants hanging in near folds from his belt-cinched waist and with a tiny smile peeking through the wary upward angled gaze of his dim blue eyes. As if to say, at night, I often dream that a bomb is exploding in my hands, Victor Shklovsky. I was not a survivor. I was not a survivor of Harold's World War, but as a child, I did sometimes recount to my mother everything that had touched, grabbed, shoved me during the day, as if verbally purging my recent past would unbury the feeling of living in the present. On the first page of Everyday Life, Lefebvre proposes that one pick a day, do some research, learn what happened as a recorded event. Publicity, news items, and a few marginal reports are all that is now available to reconstruct the everyday life of a given day in the past. But within consciousness, where material evidence has no shelf on which to gather dust, so much stuff accrues to events that one can't purge all of it. The structure of memory is formed between what's been purged and held in. Why not make a formal writing experiment of what I never said? Why not be a rag doll self-propelling across a vortex? The non-consequential excesses this writing indulges push in the direction of an evening in 1978 with the doll walking past the York Theater on 24th Street in the Mission District, where she sometimes works as a janitor, an usher, and a popcorn seller. A young man behind her pulls her pink Indian cotton dress up over her waist, then runs past her down the street laughing with his gang of buddies, while she forces her rubbery legs back to where she had come from. With the will to be invisible, she passes back under the marquee of the York Theater, where The Deer Hunter is playing, turns left on Hampshire Street, walks up a ways, and heads up the stairs of a small house which she enters, and where inside she is greeted by the curious and concerned bee, who at that moment, looking down at her as she looks up at him, appears tall. Under the ceiling of the diminutive house, my father dunked me down in the deep water of the bay and asked me to swim to him before I knew how. Years later, huffing and puffing with arms flailing, I went with schoolmates and a teacher to Delano to bring blankets and canned goods to the striking grape harvesters. Between the bottom of the sea being cruel and a fledgling capacity for social actions was exhilaration, a sensation that dismantled blandness, torpor, clock time, stupid boys, and petty feelings. There was also the more unnerving sensation of chaos to contend with, as I couldn't organize everything properly and tell it from the station of my high school literary knowledge, routed along monumental lines of glory and trespass from Antigone to the barn burning performed by Faulkner's character, Abner Snopes. I was rescued from a certain adolescent wasteland bewilderment related to the grandeur of modernist knowledge and myth assigned to the male literary tradition when I read that Divine died yesterday in a pool of her vomited blood, which was so red that as she expired, she had the supreme illusion that this blood was the visible equivalent of the black hole, which a gutted violin seen in a judge's office in the midst of a hodgepodge of pieces of evidence revealed with dramatic insistence, as does a Jesus, the gilded chancre where gleams his flaming sacred heart. The fact of Divine's male genitals didn't matter, but the divine organization of hodgepodge in Genet's sentence, the space of alterity, did. Today, looking for a signal from 1977, the year of the performance I did at Bob and Francie's loft, and as the first talk in the Folsom Street Talk series. I find it in What's Your Idea of a Good Time? A book of correspondence between Bernadette Mayer and Bill Berkson. In a letter from 1977, Mayer writes, "So hopefully the sound will carry one through even when the sense won't." And later in the letter, "Clark and I always kid around that we don't know if we're writing poetry or prose or fiction." Organization, alterity, sound, poetry, prosaic everyday stuff translates the Folsom Loft performance into reading Clark Coolidge's The Maintains backwards, while walking backwards around the loft and conducting a crazy happening involving instructions for audience participants on sweeping floors and sitting down, as a means of discovering whether performance idioms could change the text in some ambient way. Can sense-making relocate the meaning of sound? I do like being the victim of my memories when the language is musical and the thing will write itself. I had to work at it to make more logical connections so that I wouldn't always be seeming like the person who has everything popping into her mind. Bernadette Mayer. What pops into mind is an astonishing moment at a Poetry Center related party held at a private apartment somewhere in San Francisco, at which Frances Jaffer, who remained a good acquaintance afterwards, confronted me with the story that she and two other women writers had spent the previous evening reading Property, and that she, if not they, had decided that I was destroying everything they had worked so hard to insert into literary culture. Of course, I had destructive desires, but were they focused in her direction? You think when I said what I didn't mean it? A face comes out of hiding. The minute you look the other way, a landscape of inner jargon, deprived of the distinction between abstract and concrete. No, the psychic structure of that literary moment in the extended time space of this writing is the other event, the childhood event, in which Mrs. H down the street accused me at the age of 10 of killing her husband on the day I retrieved a softball from their driveway, thereby ostensibly sending him into an apoplectic rage so grand he was stopped cold in his tracks forever. Or at least, I do not believe that a remark at a cocktail party would have survived the time it took to partake of the drink in my hand, but I left before I had tasted it. I cried hysterically, locking myself in behind my Nemo bedroom door, trying all the while to retrieve the sense of play heroism I had bolstered myself with in rescuing the ball for the little kids who had held Mr. H in awe and terror. My mother, who at first couldn't comprehend the impact this violent assertion of unreality had on me, at last resolved to confront Mrs. H, who was duly surprised by the effect of her words. After we sat down to tea with her in her lonely house, life returned to normal. Years later, around 1977, after Jim Gustafson pulled a fast one on me, I walked home in driving rain from Bush Street downtown to the Upper Haight, and as a consequence became so ill I couldn't leave my apartment for a very long time. He had called me when it was late, drizzling and cold, and told me he thought he was dying. Because he had no money and I had no money, I walked in the thin and only jacket I owned all the way to his studio apartment, where, upon my opening the door, he greeted me with bud in hand from the bed on which he wiggled in a dying man's guise of uproarious laughter. A mind's arrangement with regards to certain objects is even more important than its regard for certain arrangements of objects. Breton. Just so, a handful of Texaco road maps and a head full of seaweed would be better than this. Gustafson. When I abandoned Jim and his open to the public apartment installation with its theme song, No Money in Art, the A side of which was a cry for help, as long or cold or environmentally distressed as the Detroit River, the office manager of the Poetry Center commented that Jim had used me up just like his last girlfriend. I am not a girlfriend, I may have explained, but someone who has enjoyed a certain kind of team play, spontaneity, crashing up against the bewilderment of a self that has an uncertain relationship to survival. It was late 1977 or early 1978 before I worked there, but I was visiting the Poetry Center that day because Lewis McAdams, the director, had agreed to be on my thesis defense committee. It was astonishing and affirming when on the day of the defense, Lewis quoted from memory whole passages of what was to become the collection Under the Bridge. He had driven the foggy, winding coast road from Bolinas that morning after staying up all night memorizing text. While another examiner asked, "Why do you hate mythology?" And I might have answered, because I am making an accommodation to everyday life, alluding to hidden content I was trying to acquire. Or I might have said the I who hates mythology is a pronoun in a text gesturing toward a predicament one can only separate oneself from within provisional and performative renegotiations with language. Did I pass this exam? Anti-aesthetic gestures were equally refusals to be pretty in action, thought, or word. The grammar of this drapes itself in soma, in the lightness of the body, moved by the skeleton, the blood and water torment of menstruation and the sex that delivers one to the surprise sensation of self-coherence through the smell of somebody else. I felt more frequently than you could know that it was impossible to be female, because in speaking of the impossibility, I would condemn myself to the body difference to which the conventions of art and culture wanted to consign me. Yet I was no man of action either, as evidenced by the hallucinations appearing here to a writing subject positioned as someone to whom things happen, a semi-false position of passivity, construed in narrative passing through an intersecting line to form an X, signifying those encounters with heterosexual need that taught me cumulatively what I sought to know about a certain kind of immaturity branded in my thoughts now as American, uncompletes this sentence. This is not a literary work, I told him. This is not fussy. This is not my mother dusting the daisies. Beverly Dahlen. An image from someone else's head is likewise an image in mine, as B amuses me with a flyer he's designed for a garden party on this May Day in the year 2007. The problem is I didn't like Budweiser and thus placed myself on the sidelines of certain activities and events. For a long time, my drug of choice was Scotch, used in composing many of the works in Under the Bridge. The composition took place in various rooms. The one with the industrial spool and a pillow on the red painted floor in the tenement apartment several floors up on Roush Street. The one with the carpet and green walls in a second floor, good $160 a month apartment on Clayton. In the dining room on a table made of a door elevated on crates in Arlington, Virginia in the summer of 1977, I sweated over the problems posed by stereoscopic postcard images, but by 1978, Scotch had become less desirable, as I wrote, for she, lying on a daybed under a bay window with bad cramps in a flat which had once been Steve's, my brother John's, and mine, but was now John's and Steve's, with me a visitor in it. I stared the stranger into facing up to Maxine, who had come out of the forest bad from wet nights. I stared the stranger into facing up to Maxine, who had come out of the forest bad from wet nights. I came from an odd bed of vermilion riot attracted to loud dogs. It would be impossible to make a completely different arrangement from those initiated by two sentences drifting together. The tactics in For She and those of this writing, however, share in common sites of somatic experience as engaged by a concept-motivated mentality. The body purges words, but Francie Shaw held a glorious feast of quail and roast potatoes, which she filmed with Steve assisting on a second camera in the Folsom Street loft with the light and shadows from her window seeming to devour everything. The guests were feeding the light. Taking the advice of Abigail Child, Francie had enrolled in Warren Sonbert's class at the Art Institute, and he invited me to sit in. We heard lectures on Vertov, Hitchcock, Cirque, and Stan Brackage's The Act of Seeing with One's Own Eyes. Bodies in the scene morgue would be pulled out on gurneys and dissected while the recording device of the eye, the camera, documented the fat and skin sectioned and pulled away from the organs and skeleton. It was an act performed in the color of institutional green. In Brackage's film, the green read as materiality reflecting random value systems. A year or so later, in the fall of 1978, I found myself on a gurney in a similar environment with a sense of being accused of having an ectopic pregnancy. It was not if not an accusation, it was also not a diagnosis, but something devised by a teaching hospital to persuade me to undergo endoscopy for the benefit of interns. I refused the offer, but they knocked me out and gave me a D&C just in case I was making the wrong decision about the other risky operation. The next morning, I was told I had to stay there for no reason. So I got out of bed, put on my clothes, and walked home, bedraggled, sweaty, grieving, and mad as hell. I wonder if I had not studied with movement artist Suzanne Helmuth in graduate school, whether I would have understood that my body was at that moment mine to move. We ate cabbage soup while discussing my pregnancy, the same way professional crapshooters pick up the dice without checking the game out first. I couldn't stop talking about muscles, and you strained to listen, making sure nobody eavesdropped on the intimacy. In a movement workshop, I learned how to shout without raising my voice and to experience words as extensions of the body bouncing around in space. This workshop is responsible for a change in my writing around the time of the composition of Where You and Ah Nom. Summer Brenner, whose novella The Missing Lover is set in the upheaval of Paris in May '68, doesn't recall an outdoor reading at an actualist convention on Blake Street in Berkeley in April 1977, where she gathered a circle around her and in an extraordinarily quiet recitation addressed her audience with direct and generous confidence. Nonetheless, she tells me, so much of my life then was inspired by dance and circle. Her performance motivated me to think about the manner in which I would choose to connect with or remove myself from an audience. I attended another actualist convention near the East Bay bus terminal in San Francisco in December 1977, at the moment when things seemed to be falling apart. I had missed Summer's reading performance with flautist Susan Levin, but I did not miss Andre Kudrescu in a black leather jacket bantering with Jim Gustafson, intoxicated and in shirt sleeves, about wanting to leave San Francisco, a worthless energy drain of a city. They left. Jim died in 1996, and now I live on the border of the city where Jim returned. On October 11th, 1979, I was to be employed by the Poetry Center for yet another 18 months or so. On that day, exactly 2 years from when I had read with Lyn at the grand piano, I was assisting in recording a reading by Berkeley poet Robert Haas, which concluded with a paradoxical declaration against language poetry. As a lyric poet, he proffered to the audience a hypothetical version of language poetry, one closer to truth, beauty, memory, the senses, and nature. I leave it to you, dear reader, to interpret the meanings implicated in the last 2 lines of the poem, such tenderness, those afternoons and evenings, blackberries, blackberries, blackberries. United against the despised other, the full house audience, as if at a political rally, roared its approval. It was one of the many days that meditations at Lagunitas and language poetry combined to make history, because all poetry is language poetry. My first book, Percentage, had come out earlier in the year. It was the 23rd hand-printed book in Lyn's Toomba chapbook series. A cornstalk thins under skeleton hands. The lady liar popper fidgets by a brick wall and howls at the young man who stares at a huge fake flower bulging out of a man holding his pet's tongue against the cityscape in order to hoax an unsuspecting woman protecting her spoons. Stendhal. At the Poetry Center, my next boss after Tom had been reading Percentage and wanted to know where in Stendhal she could find those words. They were fabricated. Stendhal was a pseudonym for language and play, another poem written for Warren Sonbert and included in the same collection was also composed as an improvisation on simulacra, but within different circumstances of obscurity. In a San Francisco movie theater, while Sonbert's Divided Loyalties was playing, the hand wrote in a notebook while the eye watched the screen, and his rhythmic linkings of images passed by in silence. What would happen when word images and word syntax performed a kind of parallel play with film image and film syntax? Shadows, feet in dead whiter rows, barge upon joyride, then shuts off grave. Nothing has a valid reality outside the whole chain of images, said Warren in a lecture. What is the relationship between the whole chain and demystification of spectacularly fragmented, Lefebvre, lived reality within the eye-hand language circuit? Abigail Child may have been asking a similar question when she cut up documentary footage about radical nuns, reforming the material into a montage dance of nuns' hands. I watched the film with her a couple of times in her South of Market loft, and each time I saw it, I felt a desire to float. So yeah, the job is everywhere, and in that sense, every time you lie down on it, you lay on it. I hadn't thought of that. No, who has? You did just now, but was the thought just an idle and reverse? I'll consider the question and let you know. I have to get over this feeling. What feeling? The tearful one, that's all. It's now 5:15. The day stalls in passing time. The casket opens. My friend doesn't look like my friend. You don't have to report on your sadness, but I am sorry. What is your relationship to time travel? Would you like to walk over to the brewery? It's been about 18 months. The measure of 2 full-term pregnancies. I'd rather just open a beer. I've never had beer for breakfast. It's 5:20, so you skipped breakfast and went straight to the off hours. Whoever gets off work at 5 p.m. anymore? Somebody, but you weren't working anyway. You said everything is a job, and that's why lying down on the job is still being at work. Something like that. Thank you.
So now I'm back as moderator. Thank you, Carla, for a spectacular, I use the word spectacular not in the Debordian sense, but in the performative sense, in that that was like, if the GP TV series is a series in language writing in performance, this has been an exemplary instance of that. I suggest that everyone move to gallery view now so that you can see each other. And as we move into the question and answer or comment and response period, the easiest way to register that you have something to ask or to comment on and invite Carla's response to is either to raise your literal hand like this, and I will move between the gallery screens and try to spot anyone who has their hand up, or an equally efficacious or inefficacious way of signaling that you have a question or comment is to go to the reactions area at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you click on that, and there's a little icon of a raised hand, and you can click on that, which would save you from having to make the effort of holding your hand up in the air while I look for you. So are there any, let's see, and then the chat, someone has to leave. Yeah, okay, there's no questions there. That's the other place you could put the question.
There is a question there, Lyn, from Kim Hunter.
Okay, Kim, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, or
it's in the chat.
Okay. Can you talk about having a gender for seriousness? Did I hear that correctly? The duet of work and idleness and the thread of work throughout is very Detroit. Yay for that. Carla?
A gender for seriousness? Wow. I don't think I said that. I agree with the last part of his comment, but let me just refer to the text. I think it's right up in the front part of the yeah. Oh, I see well, one of the things I was doing is just like extending the sentence and being very playful, and I have this phrase against which plays may seem connected to some feminine impossibility, ludicity, impermanence, immensity, extending sentences ludicrously, lengthily. So I guess I was gendering both play and seriousness at that moment, but I don't know if I was doing it in a binary way. Maybe somebody else can tell me. I was thinking about trying to write something that goes back to this old essay of Chris Davis on feminist time and writing, because I think that there was something that I was kind of channeling from that period in this particular piece of writing, and also in some of my other writing in the grand piano, with these kind of considerations of monumentality and history and temporalities that are other two, or, shift through certain kinds of conceptualizations of time. But I in some ways, I finally thought maybe it wasn't all that timely to do that, or that it would take me more work than I wanted to do, speaking of flavor, at this moment, in a time of working really hard.
Maybe I could insert a question here. I mean, I wrote down like a series, which I won't try to go through, but thinking about the question of it seems to me that, like, thinking back, it seems to me that the recovery of everyday life as a subject for serious study was initiated by feminist scholars in the late 70s and 80s, as well as by the Annales School of French historiography. And I got interested in questions of everyday life in that context as something that, as I imagined it then, and as may be accurate, women think of more closely and more recurrently than men. But the theme of everyday life was very much present in your presentation today. And I wonder if you have ever imagined like something like a poetics of everyday life, or everyday life as itself, a poetics, or as a source for poetics. I don't know. You have.
Well, everyday life can become easily. I guess I was in some ways playing with like a conceptual contrast between something like reported experience and then conceptualizations of everyday life that, sort of come out of those texts. And so, the like Marxist understanding of everyday life that's like coded by like work time and leisure time and so on, in contrast to something that doesn't really obey that system, and is neither just a report on experience or something that is using that analytical system with allegiance. And so if I were to do that, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about, I guess some kind of third space, which is a term that people use sometimes, but it's something I ran across in some of Kit's writing today as a way of imagining different kinds of configurations and blendings that have to do with some kind of becoming within some kind of understanding of what everyday life might be. That also, I mean, the thing that troubles me right now is like it's much easier to think about those conceptualizations from 30 years or 40 years or 50 years earlier than it is to even think about everyday life right now. Like, I'm always wondering, like, what am I, is it only everyday life? Am I swallowed in something that I don't know the boundaries of?
I think there's a message that Kit has a hand. Kit, do you have a question?
Yeah, Kit did, and then Tom has a hand up.
Okay.
And Avital too. Yeah.
Okay, Kit, Tom,
Yeah.
Avital.
Okay, I just unmuted, so I guess you guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought a lot about your prose because your sentences were amazing, and especially the ones that, as you say, extended. I got the sense that you were thinking while you were writing and making moves and making decisions and incorporating different contexts and piling things on top of each other and then subtracting something. And it was like, what did I made a note here, an erector set of dependent clauses.
Oh, how wonderful.
But some of them were, but I couldn't tell though if it was your work or that or something that you were quoting. And an example of that would be the description of the death of divine.
That's
which
Janae.
So yeah, so
Yeah, that's
so
Our
that was a
Lady, that's Our Lady of the Flowers. Yeah.
that sentence in itself is like a paradigm of what I'm trying to talk about in relation to your work, because it went on for a great long time and it finally ended up in the heart. So I thought that was very dramatic and terrific.
Yeah, well, like I was saying, like Janae kind of, I guess, rescued me from this sort of feeling of something impossible in relationship to the way that I learned modernism. And that actually, I would say that's kind of, that's true enough.
Already I forgot the order.
Avital was going to ask a question.
Okay, and then Tom had one. So, okay, let's go to Tom first because he was ahead of Avital in my list. I remember that. Tom? Unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm unmuted. Well, first of all, I thought it was just an incredibly exciting reading, Carla. Made me so happy. For one thing, talking about the formalization or the introduction of intellectual system thinking or theoretical thinking into every day, that's certainly very much what La Dérive is about. And in fact, you could say that that's in one sense, step after step after step, a characterization of much of 20th century intellectualism from just from the beginning on. You could even say, if you wanted, that it started with or was marked by Proust or whatever you want. In any case, for sure, it's a thread that keeps sewing. And I don't know if I have anything more to say than that. Other than that, I just was knocked out by the work. You as I always am.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I got to this, thing about after quoting some of the little system of the Dérive, I wrote, in these times of surveillance, insanity, and landscape death, the Situationist Urbanist project, whose purpose was the constant diminution of border regions within the city and suburbs up to the point of their complete suppression, seems as naive and comical as it is compelling and revelatory. And so I guess that's this thing I'm clumsily trying to, that's an example of the thing that I'm kind of clumsily trying to find some fuzzy language for.
Well, we were trying, it's hard, given who we all are. It's where do you look for strength? Where do you look for tools to change the world? But in that, and well, I'll leave it at that.
So Avital was going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Avital, please.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're well and strong. And I want to thank you, Carla, so much, and everyone for this kind of listening that we're engaged in. And I was taken, among other things, by the way I think you framed it with Kathy Acker, perhaps, and started a stinky machine going. And that switched on my Nietzschean sense of flair and smelling a rat, and also the contemporary everyday life of losing smell through COVID prods and anxieties. But I was considering the heightened kind of, let's say, theoretical acuity that occurs in the obsessional neurotic, according to Freud, who's always smelling stuff and pushed forward by smell. And for you, there was even, if I'm not mistaken, a little glimmer and possibility of self-coherence in the smell of the other. So I just wanted to appreciate that it's something that dissipates. It is and isn't a perception, a solidity. It's and I'm, of course, I guess not of course, but I'm speaking to you all from the stinky streets of New York right now. So I appreciate that part of everyday life, something that can't be entirely classified, was smelly. So thank you for that.
That's wonderful. So that part of the duet was from Lorenzo Thomas. And I can, I just hear him. I've heard him read the poem at other times too, but this stink to high heaven, or just in general stinks. And I can still hear his voice, him voicing that. Yeah.
Rachel, do you have a question that you wanted to ask? And then Barrett, and then I think we'll end and move to anyone who needs to leave can do so. And then those who want to stay for an informal, unrecorded social chat can stay on. But Rachel?
I didn't raise my hand, so it's been raised. I'm fascinated by other elements in the everyday life history that I would mention two other things that are extremely important in the 20th century. And one was the invention of mass observation, which was a British movement that seemed to combine sociology and poetry. That was their remit, or what their desire, they thought they desired. And they got regular people whom they sort of recruited, as I understand it, to write to fixed topics, like as if it were a creative writing workshop. I'm joking, of course, but it's a very interesting thing to follow it. And the reason I started to know about it at all was that HD was recruited to write about, God help us, I was going to say inauguration, the coronation of George whatever before Elizabeth. Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the most that's one of the big examples of what that is. But there's also this like surveillance thing, like people are like,
yeah, because what happened
No,
I mean, what's interesting, what happened to it was it went into surveillance, and the kind of what's it? I'm losing my words, of course, from old age. But when people market research, when people do market research, it went directly into the sociology of of forced consumerism and so on. So it definitely deteriorated. Okay, another historical example would be Christa Wolf, who did this monumental book called something like One Day a Year, and a designated day. It's an amazing book. She would write, I think it was 40 years, it might have been only 35. And it was both filled with truth and filled with lies, in a sense, because, you can never tell the truth about your own life. But I recommend it highly. Speak of a Marxist writing,
right.
A book about everyday life, her own, but of course it was like a network that captured everything. And that's the only thing, Lyn was calling on me for some reason. I just want to say it was a spectacular reading. And I was interested in the word idol. That was, I mean, because you repeated that passage twice.
Right.
What was it, an IDYL?
IDYLL. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Because the first time I wasn't sure it was IDOL
Yeah.
or an IDLE, just because I couldn't hear the syntax. I like the layering though. So anyway, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. That was
Welcome.
wonderful.
So I'll
Karen?
take responsibility for texting or chatting to Lyn. Say, I think Rachel raised her hand, and so it was my fault.
It's okay. It was.
That's what I thought. I thought I saw something like a gesture in that direction. So I obviously would like to hear what you had to say. But so going back to everyday life. So yeah, Lefebvre, Agnes Heller, and a whole move towards, kind of phenomenology intersecting with the everyday. So how do you think the everyday? How do you think the quotidian? And that's late 60s, early 70s. But a moment that I thought was really interesting. Well, one was Kit's point about work and idleness, bringing back Kristen Ross's work on everyday life and what she has to say about the right to laziness. This is in her work around Rimbaud. So the right to laziness. So thinking about work and the right to laziness, and I'm plugging that back into your connection with the anarchists in Paris. Where there's some form of freedom that is being, known or insisted on or lived or attempted to be lived. That is also the right to be a shirker, to not, put your head to your queer shoulder at the wheel, as Ginsburg said, but also to see the work in that right to laziness. And then there's the encounter with Sartre, who's sitting over there in the cafe, and he's over there. And I think that over there-ness is really, really interesting. Like, you're not gonna be Sartre, but he's over there. And that asideness, I think, might be one way to negotiate those two sides of the coin, really, the purposiveness and the right to not have to be purposive every minute. So that's my comment. Anybody want to do a closer, and then we'll stop the recording? George.
Hi. With respect to everyday life, I was just thinking about how different it is at different stages of life. Until I was 8, it was one way. Then we moved to running a rooming house, and it totally became a totally different, wild experience. Going to MIT was a weird part of everyday life, and so on. As I go through different stages of life, what's every day is really totally different. And for example, when I was 8 years old, going down to the Navy base in Bayonne with a guy who was a deep sea diver, and watching him go come up through the machines that he had to go into so he didn't get the bends, and doing this regularly, and then on Saturday nights going to the Navy base to see the wrestling matches. I mean, this is it's my everyday life, nothing like what I've lived since then. And if I go through different stages of that, I can go through similarly crazy differences in everyday life. And the notion of what's every day is wildly different for different professions, for different ways of being, and so on. This is something that's interests me. Why is it that everyday life is so different? Incredibly different. What are there forms of everyday life? Are there structures of everyday life? Hard to imagine. I don't know, but it's worth thinking about. What kind of structures of everyday life could there be? I mean, there's work life. If you go to jobs, 8 hours a day or something like that, that's one kind of everyday life. If it's a sort of dumb job, it's one way. If it's an interesting job, it's another way. So the idea of everyday life is not one thing by any means. It's an unlimited number of things.
Paul Elwar wrote in order to recover this freak of birth, one must age.
Okay.
All right, we will leave it at that. Thank you, Carla. Thanks to all of you that offered a question or a comment. That's extremely important part of this series of events. We invite you to return to the next of the GPTV events, which will be featuring Ron Silliman and moderated by Ray Armentrout. And that will be on Thursday, December 15 at 8 p.m. East Coast time, 5 p.m. Pacific time. So back to the usual format. Thanks to Carla on behalf of Chax Press for moving her show to today so that there wasn't a conflict between those two readings. And yes, welcome back in 2 weeks, everybody. And thank you again, Carla. And now the recording will go off.